Cool. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. And I just realized there are two difficult things that are there on top of my mind right now. One is actually sitting in front of Zoom continuously for 2.5 hours, which I can't help with you in any ways. The second one is actually managing your test data when you're writing an automation framework. So let's talk about that. To the next slide, Andrew. I'm Nalnikant, often called as Nal. So I have 9 years of experience. I've been a QA, PO, and currently doing a security analyst role. I'm a lead consultant at ThoughtWorks, and I also play the role of security community lead for ThoughtWorks India. That's a bit about me.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Yes, so my name is Anirudh, and total I have got a 5 years of overall experience in quality assurance with automation and also on mobile testing. So here in ThoughtWorks, I'm a senior consultant. Yep, that's all in a very brief note of mine.
Cool. Before we get into the deeper topics, I'll quickly set up the agenda and we'll give you some disclaimers of what we're going to talk today. And to start with, we're going to talk about flakiness in test automation. How does the flakiness come and where are the things that it'll fall into and stuff like that. So we'll talk about few test data strategies which you manage technically. Some of them which Arun has actually spoke about in the last talk as well. So we'll keep it very light and we'll talk about test data management, actual test data management of your application and how you can use the modern tech stack that is available out there to make your life easy. And we'll also talk about what approaches you can take, and we'll close that with the do's and don'ts and what do we think the best way of going forward is. So that's the agenda. And yes, before I talk about flakiness, so everything that you see in this presentation is purely from experience that we have used, the approaches that we've created, the approaches that we have used, and the approaches that we've tried, failed, and reinvented. So that's where this entire talk is coming from. So if you want to use bits and pieces of these approaches, it is still fine. There is no specific rule that you have to use any given approach in the same way that we talk about today. So yes, with that, let's talk about flakiness. So we all write automation. We all write good automation, and we'll see our tests failing on the pipelines. We'll see test runs failing every now and then, and then we'll think about what happened. And when you dig deeper, most of the times what we find is our framework is not robust enough, or we have some badly written tests, or our element locators are something that changing every time, or we're not able to find those specific locators which will help you to have a robust test. Sometimes we wait on synchronization, we fail on synchronization by managing weights, even though you manage weights, maybe your network bandwidth or maybe your server is slow or something like that, that will affect. And oftentimes we also fail because we use shared test environments. We don't know what state the environment is going to be when the test is starting. Uh, we don't have tests managing their own test data or have some hard-coded test data that you go ahead and use in your tests. And having test data that is dependent on one other test. So basically you have few tests where the test data is interlinked, and you keep reusing that. So if you look at least the things that I've kept on the slide, most of that would fall under the way how you manage your test data. So that takes a huge piece of how do you manage test data in your entire life cycle of your test automation. So it is very important for you to think about test data even before you start automating your test case. So that's the core intent of which we're starting the talk with. Do you want to go to next slide? Yes, Andrew, do you want to continue from here?
Yes. So basically here the test data, which is like literally a very big and a vast topic. So what we have done is like we have divided into two categories. One is a small elephant and one the big elephant. So here comes a small elephant, which says using the test data strategies in a technical way. So what are all the approaches? So in our general day-to-day career or day-to-day our QA strategies or QA work, we used to have on a very high level of four parts. externalizing the test data, stub or using the mock responses, or the using the fakers data, and finally using the external third-party tools. So we have broadly classified all the different type of strategies in a technical way in a 4 different ways, which I have just started. So without getting delayed, let us go deeper into what is these 4 approaches, or what are the 4 strategies are. So first one, which is externalizing the test data. So generally, this is one of the traditional way for using the test data management part. So basically, for every now and then, Selenium is being used in a very normal way. So even like there are many tools though. So basically, here in externalizing the test data, what we would be doing is like we would be keeping the entire test data in one single file, which may be a JSON, which may be an XML, which may be a CSV, or which may be like any dot properties file. And we then pull the test data from that storage, and we give it to the application test, and we also make assertions out of it. So this is what something we call it as externalizing the test data. This is being used in many of the situations in plenty of the areas. So coming to the next part, which is called as like stubbed or mock responses. So here, whenever, let's say, we are having a situation wherein we wanted to use some kind of backend call or some kind of API response, but always hitting the server or always hitting the API call makes some kind of noise here and there. So what we can make generally is something, as we are only focusing on the UI part or only focusing on that tool or that specific part, we can use stubbed or mock responses, where it doesn't hit the external URL or doesn't hit the API call, wherein we receive the mock response or the stubbed response without hitting the database. This is also a kind of approach which really helps or really makes the clear-cut uh, parity on what are the test cases passing and what are all the test cases which are failed. And coming to the third one, which is fakers. So basically, this is some kind of a new tool which came into existence. Of course, not a new tool though. Fakers is something we are almost faced many issues using the same test data each and every time. So fakers is some kind of a library which gives us different kind of fake data. Let's say like if you are able to see the screen, in the screen you can also see faku.name.firstname, which gives the first name with different format. When you also rerun, it doesn't needs to be the same value. It again changes the value. So we can also use some kind of library tools which called as fakers. This fakers is being used widely on the automation part, and we also have one more, which like few more parts, which is like we can also use temporary mail address. This is the site, and we can also use temporary or fake phone numbers. We can also have different kind of SMS coming up when you see there are body and date. And next, we also have credit card generations, something like demo credit cards and all. We can just use this card number with CVV and so on. We can also use this mechanism as a fakers data. So on a very broad view, fakers really helps us in making the use of clearly test data. And finally, we can also use external test data solutions. Like nowadays, there are like big MNC companies coming forward saying like, hey, we do have this kind of test data management tool, or we do have this test data solutions. So some of them are CA, Dataproof, Inform, and Delphix and Teststep. So likewise, these 5 or these externalizing test data solutions have pros and cons being varied from part to part. But this could really help you out when you really need of managing your test data with externalizing part. And I strongly suggest you go through those terms and conditions and even more oftenly the requirement of the part. So basically, these are all the technical related stuff for managing the test data strategies. Now, here comes the big elephant, which is test data. So, Nal, you want to proceed?
Cool. So there is a question in Q&A. I'll answer that before we go forward. So the question is that does test data include both the data that is used for filling the web forms in the UI automation scripts and also the data used for assertions? Actually, test data is way more beyond that. So obviously the data that you fill in the automation or the scripts or the automation when the script is filling it on the UI automation, that's one part. But any data that you need to use from the application or you need to verify, everything falls in the bucket of test data. This actually makes me think of something that if you don't know what you are expecting, you'll not be able to verify it. So obviously you need to know your assertions. So what data you need to assert on. So that is very important. So that's also a part of test data. So that's why we have to take care of this data uh, very, objectively, and we'll have to think about uh, what are we creating actually. That's what we're going to talk about right now. So one second. So maybe we'll talk about that secret data at the end, Anand, but I'll come back there. So, okay, test data lifecycle. So again, as I told, most of us often tend to do this mistake that when you are given a simple scenario of, say, for example, I want you to register a user on a website. What do you go and do to create the automation script? So ideally, most of us tend to go ahead and create the script rather than thinking about what happens with the data when we run that script, or actually what is the data that is existing and what happens with the data when we run the script. So that is something that we often tend to miss, but it is very important for us to think through whenever we're creating an automation suite or a frame, a huge set of tests that we are having in our framework. You need to think through what is the state that I'm talking, starting the test with, and going forward, how do I create the test data? How do I use it? And then how do I maintain that or maybe delete it? So that's what we often tend to miss. So make sure that you think about this test data lifecycle from the application standpoint in correlation with your automation whenever you're building an application. The important thing is when you design your test scripts, think about what are the requirements that I have and what are the environments that I'm gonna run this test script on, and how do I gonna set up the data and what are the dependencies that I have. Say for example, if you want to buy a product on an e-commerce website, you will not be able to do a checkout without having a user that is already there or signed up on the website. You'll still be able to do without signing up, uh, but you'll not be able to verify all the cases. So if you want to check out with a user, you need to have a user who is signed up already. So now the question comes, you always have a user who is signed up, and you always take the user and create a cart with some items and then you check out, or you create the user every time when you create the I mean, when you want to do a checkout. So create a fresh user and do a checkout. So now should I go approach one or should I go approach two? Both of them has its own pros and cons. And if you are taking one of them, you're missing something. So you might have to test both the approaches. So that's where it becomes very critical. Because if I create new user every time, I'll not have a lot of orders that are there back in my, orders history. So that would be the problem. So and that is where you have to think about creating these scenarios and creating that test data. And once you have that part, how do you store that? That is very important. And how do you redo it? So that is something that we are going to talk today. The usage, how do you use this data? How do you modify? If required, how do you recreate this data? That is also important. And the last part comes to maintenance. Do you version this data? Do you always go for recreation, and or do you always go for deletion? So that is where your test automation robustness will depend on in terms of test data. Can you go to next slide? So some properties, your test data should be accessible in terms of different ways. Like I was talking about, I want a user who has so many orders, yet I want a user who is new. And it should be easy for you to clean up your test data. And portability, when you're thinking about running this same test on another environment, how do you port your test data? Or is it even possible for porting your test data with your automation framework? A simple question that you can ask is like, if I run the same test on a different environment, will my test pass? So that is the simplest question that you can ask for yourself. And accuracy, so that will help you to create a robust test set. So the accurate test data that I want. Like I was telling, if I don't know what I'm going to expect, or I'll not be able to make any assertion. So that is something about accuracy. And then completeness. I was talking about dependencies earlier. So when you are chaining multiple test cases, or when you're chaining multiple functionalities, so you need different test data that's coming from different spaces, then you would need some completeness about this test data. I'll give you a simple example. So for example, if you are testing anything like a pharmaceutical application, so you need to know the combinations of the drug in order to verify some of the assertions, whether this combination is possible to cure this particular disease, or this medicine can be taken for a disease or not. So that's where you need that mapping of test data. You need chaining from different functionalities and stuff like that. So the last one is reusability. So wherever you're going to take this, your test data should be reusable. You should be able to easily modify that, and maybe recreate another version of it and reuse it. So that's another property. So try to maintain these properties, so that will make your life easy. So with that.
So basically, using all these like the test data lifecycle and as well as the properties of test data, if we both ask you to just write down a test case or make out a test data for a registration form for a user, so what do generally the people do? It's something like people definitely write something using the test data management principles and as well as uh, the test ng parts and all. So basically, the users might write like this: the username, the password, the last name, and the first name. So when we run this for the first time, it executes. And you see, the test case has passed. But now, if I rerun the same test case, what happens? If I rerun the same test case with the same user details, there comes the real problem, which says the username has already been used. So now we can say, hey, why can't we change the data each and every time when we run? But let's say if we are able to do it on a regression way, what happens if we wanted to execute this on a parallel part? What happens if we really wanted to make this run on multiple systems? We cannot change the test data each and every time. So here comes the big elephant, which really is what our topic is: the test data creation approaches. Nal?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Anirudh.
Yep. So here comes the four big main topics which we thought of producing it. So first is something which is called as elementary approach. Second is data source, something like you can use predefined databases. And third, we can also create infrastructure, which we call it as infrastructure recreation. And finally, we can also say data generation on demand. So without delete, let's dive deeper, which is like the elementary approach. So generally, elementary approach is with a very similar way, which is something like we can create test data as per requirement or as we required on the code, which we have already said something to use the fakers. So I'll quickly show you a video for using the fakers demo. Uh, so basically, this is the code, and we just used faker library and dot username dot last name dot first name. So now here I have already created one user, but when I try to create the same, when I try to run the same with the same username, it says it got failed. Now the first approach, what I'm trying to use here is something the fakers. So when I run using the fakers data, you see the database, the username is something different. See here, pronounce something. Okay, I'm I'm bad at reading out that one. Federica something. Yeah, this is the one, and you see the test case has passed. Now the problem has been solved. I can use the same library to run in a parallel way, to run in a regression way, to run using uh, different environments parallelly. Now the problem has been solved using the fakers or using the elementary approach. Yeah, this is the demo what I have just shown you.
Cool. Coming to the pros and cons of this approach, it's very easy to create. You have the Fakers library and you have so many other solutions out there which you can use. It is time saving. You don't have to think about any data strategy and all, and it is very easy to understand. It was just that simple library. It's gonna give you a realistic fake data. So that's the irony about it. The data looks real, but it's the fake data that it gives you. So these are the pros. The cons when it comes to this strategy is uh, there is no robust creational or cleanup strategy. So you can't decide on what do I create and what do I clean, or maybe that won't clean for yourself. You have to manually clean it afterwards if there is a possibility. So the dynamic data cannot be created for all cases. So if you go back, I again might have to create so many faker libraries if I have to think about situations which are very tightly coupled with your domain, like maybe banking calculations or maybe pharmaceutical mapping of those compounds to the uh, the drugs that will come out and the symptoms that will be used against and all of that. So the data creation might lead a lot of random data unless you figure out a library like fakers, which is already existing. And yeah, again, difficult to use it in a complex environment where you have a lot of mapping and uh, a place where you have a lot of correlation between your domain and your data. So that's the problem. So you cannot use this against all the cases. So you might have to choose what are the simple cases where you can go with this approach and where you cannot go with this approach. Cool. Can we go to the next slide, Anirudh? So the next one is a data source approach. So this is basically one of the familiar ways for me when I at least started testing things. So I wanted databases with different states, with different known states, obviously. So one of the easiest things for me is to, create a script and execute that script before my test runs and run the test. And after that, execute another script to clean up the database. So uh, that's the thing that we were doing. So it is very easy, but heavily dependent on that scripting part of, how do you write the data to the database and how do you create delete it every time. And obviously, one other interesting thing about that is this might work for you on all environments because your application configuration would remain constant. So that's about this approach. So can you go to the next slide, Anirudh? So this is really good for someone who is good with scripting, has a lot of SQL knowledge and all. And versioning can be done. I can have multiple SQL scripts, and I have the ability to manipulate data. Obviously, before running your suite, you would all mostly connected with your database. So you can manipulate data at runtime using another SQL script and stuff like that. The cons would be you need frequent changes to create those scripts. You need to, so there is any uh, change that happens on the development side, you need to create a change on the script as well. So this is not on your automation. This is again on this scripting part. So that would need some maintenance. So the data creation will be a dependency to rerun the test. So if you have to run somewhere in between, in the last session, someone is asking like, hey, if I stop somewhere in between, can I start rerunning from that same step? So that makes, that actually is a situation when you don't have isolation. So Now, even in this case, if you are following something like this, I don't want to run all the steps that ran till now. I want to start from where I stopped. So that would be the difficulty that we'll face when we go to this approach. So you need scripts for both removal and creation. And one thing that you might have to again put some sort of maintenance. It's not impossible, but it's difficult is if you are changing versions from, for the database from one version to another version, your scripts are dependent on your database version. So you might have to again make some changes to the scripts, and you might have to rewrite some of these scripts. So the next one is my favorite approach, heavy on infrastructure, but not possible every time. So basically, with the existing technologies like Docker, basically take the backup of the database, make an image, restore the backup whenever you want to run your test, and then shred the image or get the container down, and again follow the same process whenever you want to run the tests, do the same approach, get your image up and just get the environment up using Docker or something, and then restore the backup and run your tests and again destroy it. So, Anirudh, you want to show the demo?
Sure.
So basically what we have done here is we have created the entire stack in 3 different Docker containers, and we have plugged all of them together. So actually there is one test container also that runs the tests here. All of them are glued together with one simple command. You get everything up and the test will run, and uh, it will also close. And also if you want to sustain the environment, and if you want to take run UI automation, or you want to plug in UI automation or something like that inside that, that is still possible. And you can also make sure you have the state of that particular instance, even if you want to debug further and all. So that is easy when you do this. Not going too deep into technicals, otherwise it would be an infrastructure session, how to build that sort of environment. But this knowledge needs a little heavy uh, a toll on infrastructure, because you might want to create your own stack by yourself, or maybe you need someone else doing it for you.
Yep. So when you see, I have rerun the same create user test with the same username and password. But due to this wonderful creation, as Null said, Docker, I'm able to pass, or I'm able to get a success response for the same username and the password details.
Cool. Coming to the pros, it's an easy approach. You can just take the backup of a specific image state, and you can create a container out of it, and you can glue it to your application, and you can run it. So the state can always be saved for further data analysis, and can be plugged into your automation solution as a prerequisite, or you can also glue your automation tests within the Docker in another container and glue it, so that you directly get the report. So you don't have to worry about anything, just run one command and get the report out. So that would be the pros of this approach. The cons, it would become costlier as the architecture becomes complex. So that's one thing. And every run needs a restore for this as well. Uh, Difficult to rerun the failed tests, specifically the data dependent ones. You might want to make some changes to your existing state and then run them, and might not work in all cases. If you are looking at a highly complex environment with huge number of microservices and all of that, so in order to get the entire system up, you might need a lot of effort. For the smaller, simpler architectures, this is fairly easier than the complex architecture. So that's where your cost and effort, both of them will grow exponentially when your architecture is complex. So yes. Cool. The next approach is again one of the interesting approaches. This is using what your application gives you. So create, update, and delete the data on demand. So two approaches that you can use with this is the API and UI. But fairly don't use the UI if you don't want to create the data to test something. if possible, use APIs. And at the same time, in the last session, while we were talking about Playwright has the possibility of creating API tests or UI tests. So you can use that capability to create your data, run your test, and then tear down the same data. That is fairly simpler. So this will provide you a huge isolation. So your tests are the owners of the test data. So it is very easy for you to tell that, hey, my test data depends on this, and the test data is just generated before the start of the test, and it is teared down after the test. So yeah, cool. Next slide, Anirudh. We didn't do a demo for this in the interest of time. When we did the dry run, we were crossing 40 minutes, but we hope you have done this multiple times using APIs to create data, and just club it with your UI automation whenever you require something. But the only interesting part here is, can you go to the next slide? The interesting part here would be on the cons side. Your developers might not be giving you the delete functionality all the time. So you may be able to create a user with a API, but you might not be able to delete a user with a API, or that might have some complex mechanism of, even before you delete the user, do some other random operations which were mapped to this. So that would be the con. And difficult for any data intensive applications, like if you're testing a data analytics application, or you're testing some dashboards and all of that. Creating data through the APIs would be the second approach that I would go for. Maybe I would go for the infrastructure approach or the scripts approach, so that I already have the data and then I just run the tests and see whether things are working or not. So uh, when you are deleting data through APIs or through UI, it is very hard for you to delete the transactional data in complex systems like banking and all of that. It's easy to delete the simple data rather than the transactional data, because there would be multiple tables that would be getting updated in the back end of the simple UI that we see. So yeah, may lead to critical situation if proper disaster management technique is not implemented. So when you're creating data and deleting data, if you don't follow a proper strategy, you might end up with a messy state of your test environment. Coming to the pros, it is very easy. You all might like this. Even I like this approach. It is fast. It is cost effective. It is part of your automation suite, so it isolates the tests, and it can be plugged into any automation solution. Even if you're using something like Selenium and you don't have a capability of running tests directly with Selenium library, you can add REST assured to it, or any other library of your interest, and you can plug this within that. And it is very robust in nature compared to other approaches. So if you are using this very well, then you might not need the other approaches as well at times. But it all comes to the design of your test data and your automation suite together. Yeah, cool. So that calls for your test data management, makes your test automation more robust. So as I told you, none of these approaches are something like you pick it and use it as a straightforward solution. You might have to mix and match things. You might have to uh, club one or two approaches in this, and then take this forward. Yes. Some of the do's and don'ts that we wanted to talk about. So three core principles when you are thinking of test data for your automation tests. Have adequate data before your test runs, or make sure your test creates it and run it. For all the automation suites, you need to make sure across the environment. So this is very important. Otherwise, your tests are going to be flaky again. So yeah, as I told you, you can acquire it on demand. So when you don't need it, don't create it. Don't depend on the state of the application. So make sure if you can create anything on demand, go for it. Go for the last approach that we've been talking about. So always remember that your test data does not limit or is not a specific constraint that will stop you running from any automation scenario. So you just have to think on your ROA, whether I'm going to do this scenario or not. That's the only thing that should be on back of your mind. But this is not something that should restrict you, in stopping you from building automation. So these are the core principles, and I have actually stolen this from the Dora research, so DevOps research that's done by Google. Yes, go for the next slide, Anirudh. So, and also one of the important things is we all try to do some easiest things that calls for getting that production data onto our test environments, and running running our test environments with that clone, and using it to run our automation test suite and all of that. So one important thing, your production data might be sensitive. Always use some sort of masking process or some sort of anonymization process when you're doing this, and make sure if you don't require the entire data, don't take the entire data. Take only a specific amount of data that is required for your test runs, and then take out the other data. So there are libraries like the one that I pinged you in chat, which will help you in anonymization. You don't have to build everything bottoms up by yourself, but these libraries can help you to get there easily. Cool. Next slide, Amrit. So this would be the last word. So as even in our last talk, we were talking about how do you reduce your efforts in E2E tests and push it down the pyramid. That's going to help you create a robust automation. Even with test data management also, uh, push your tests more towards the bottom of the pyramid, because that's where you can easily stub or you can easily mock, and you don't need a lot of dependency on test data. That's where you will be able to isolate your tests more. And as you go up the pyramid, your test data dependency will increase. So make sure you take those decisions uh, consciously, and do only those end-to-end scenarios that you want to do, and make sure you follow these other practices of uh, putting up test data accordingly for the lower level and the higher level tests, and minimize the reliance on test data as much as you can, and isolate your test data. And this is very, very important even for your any level of test that you're writing, maybe from unit test to your UI test. uh, Most unlikely that we'll not be able to create an isolated test. But this needs a thinking through the data lifecycle. If you don't think through the data lifecycle, just want to go and automate, you'll not be able to isolate the tests. And think of the data that is getting stored in the databases. You might often, because of that dependency, you might often have poor data isolation, or you might also have a performance impact down the lane, not just once, twice when you run it, but if you have a product which is running long enough down the lane, this would take a hit on the performance impact as well. So yes, make test data readily available, think through it, create that on demand, and make sure you have it when your tests are running. And always try to clean the data that you have created. So always try to clean the mess that you have created on the environments, and always try to keep the state clean. So that will help you to run robust automation tests as well. I think that's what we have for today. And there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. So the first one is, in the user adding a product to the cart and checkout example test scenario, where do we populate the product catalog? Is it part of the test case setup function? If so, do you call the backend API to populate the product catalog, or is it handled using stubs and mocks? I see that this is answered by your database that clips up. Yeah, so basically you can use any of the approaches that were out there, and it also depends on at what level you are writing these tests, so that you will be able to stub or mock that in the lower level. Or if you are doing it at a higher level, call for an API and create the data. That is something that you can choose. As a follow-up, do you load the test data in the DB for each test case test set, as they need to be isolated and not break because of test data interdependencies? This is interesting, but if we do that, the data setup will take a lot of time, and your test run also will take a lot of time. So that's why I'm talking. It's not just that I have a test, I go ahead and automate it. Don't think about it like that. You have a test automation suite. How do you want to set up test data for it? How do you want to isolate it? How do you want to run tests around that and all? So that is also something that you can think about. And also, not necessarily when we are running, say, for example, 40, 50 end-to-end scenarios, they might also have, they always have to run in the same environment unless you have only one environment. But if you have a possibility of having multiple known states, you can also create multiple known states of your application in the same database or in different databases, and you can test that. So that approach will help you reduce the time to get a faster feedback. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Just looking at the chat. Cool. There's one